Rain hammers South Boston's broken streets as black SUVs surround a butcher shop nobody dares enter. Inside waits the city's most feared mafia boss, Roman Valenti, walking straight into death. But the woman behind that counter isn't prey. She's the trap. One knife, one throat, one mistake that changes everything. If you want to know how a quiet housemaid brought an empire to its knees, stay until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels tonight. The rain didn't fall in Southie that night. It attacked. It came down sideways, slapping against brick and glass like it had a grudge against the whole neighborhood, like it knew something ugly was about to happen and wanted a front row seat. Elena Mercer stood behind the counter of her father's butcher shop with blood under her fingernails that wasn't from any animal. Not yet, anyway. The shop smelled like cold metal and sawdust and the ghost of every Sunday roast she'd ever cut for some sweet old lady who couldn't pay full price. The lights buzzed overhead, one bulb flickering like it was nervous too. She wiped her hands on her apron, an old, stained thing that used to belong to her father, and looked out the fogged window at the street. She already knew. You live in this neighborhood long enough. You learn the sound of a problem before it ever knocks. Tonight the problem came in the shape of 3 black SUVs gliding to a stop outside her shop, headlights cutting through the rain like blades. Doors opened. Men stepped out in long coats, shoulders hunched against the weather, faces carved from the same stone every enforcer in this city seemed quarried from. Elena's pulse didn't spike. It steadied. That was the thing nobody understood about her. When normal people's hearts went haywire, hers found its rhythm. Years of standing over a cutting board with a blade in her hand will do that. Years of her father's voice in her ear, calm hands cut clean, baby girl. Panic just makes a mess. The bell over the door rang once, sharp, almost violent. We're closed, Elena said without looking up, already reaching for the cleaver resting on the block beside her. Not threatening, just close enough. Don't look closed to me. The voice belonged to a big man, neck like a fire hydrant, knuckles scarred white. His name was Sal Bruno, and Elena had seen him 3 times in the last 2 months, each visit worse than the last. We're here about the Costello family's protection fee. 6th time, I'm asking nice. And it's the 6th time I'm telling you no. Sal smiled the way men smile when they think the conversation's already over. Boss is getting impatient, sweetheart. People who say no to the Costellos, they don't usually stay in business. Sometimes they don't stay breathing. Elena finally looked up. Her eyes were dark, tired in the way that comes from working 2 jobs and sleeping 4 hours a night, but there was something underneath the exhaustion, something sharp, something that had survived more than a butcher shop full of thugs could imagine. You'd be surprised what I stay, she said. That was when Sal made his mistake. He reached across the counter, grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise, and yanked her forward like she weighed nothing. Maybe you need a lesson in respect, huh? Maybe... He never finished the sentence. Elena's free hand moved before her mind even gave the order. That was the part nobody ever believed later, that her body knew the fight before her brain caught up. She twisted into his grip instead of away from it, used his own momentum, drove her elbow into the soft cartilage of his throat, and as he choked and stumbled, she swept his leg out from under him with the same calm precision she used to debone a chicken. He hit the tile floor hard enough to rattle the display case. Silence. Just the rain outside and Sal wheezing on the ground, staring up at a 130-pound woman in a blood-stained apron like she'd grown a second head. Get out, Elena said, voice flat, steady, terrifying in its calm. Tell your boss I said no. Tell him I'll say it every time. Sal's men dragged him out into the rain, and for one beat, one single breath, Elena allowed herself to feel the shake start in her hands. Then she pressed them flat against the cutting board and made it stop. Calm hands cut clean. She didn't know it yet, but that beat, that one moment of defiance in a dying neighborhood, had just lit a fuse that would burn straight to the heart of the Costello Empire. 2 miles away, in a penthouse that looked down on the city like it had personally conquered it, Roman Valenti was finishing a phone call he didn't want to be having. You're telling me, he said, voice low, controlled, the kind of controlled that scared people more than shouting ever could, that a waitress put one of my men on the floor. She's not a waitress, boss. She runs the butcher shop on Dorchester, Old Man Mercer's daughter. Roman set his glass down on the marble bar with a click that sounded louder than it should have in the silent room. He was 34 years old and had been running this family for 3 of those years, ever since his father's heart gave out at the dinner table, like the old man had finally run out of cruelty to fuel it. Roman had inherited an empire built on fear, and he'd spent 3 years proving he could hold it with the same iron grip, maybe tighter. He had a face that women noticed and men respected out of pure self-preservation. Dark hair cut close, a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete, and eyes the color of a Boston winter sky. Gray, cold, giving nothing away. But underneath the tailored suit and the expensive watch was a man who hadn't slept more than 5 hours a night since he was 22, who carried his father's voice in his skull the way other men carried debt. She broke Sal's throat, bruised it. He'll live. But, boss? The man on the phone hesitated, and Roman could hear the fear crackling through the line like static. She didn't even flinch. Sal said it was like she'd done it 100 times. Roman exhaled slowly through his nose. He thought about all the ways this could go. He could send 10 men to burn the shop to the ground. That was the easy answer, the answer his father would have given without blinking. He could send Sal back with a gun instead of a handshake. He could make an example so loud the whole neighborhood would remember it for a generation. But something about the word flinch, the absence of it, snagged in his mind like a hook in fabric. "Get the car," Roman said. "I'll handle this myself." "Boss, with respect, that's not—" "I said get the car." The rain hadn't let up by the time Roman's SU-5 pulled to the curb outside the small, unassuming butcher shop with the cracked sign that read, "Mercer and Son." The word son painted over decades ago and never quite fully erased, like even the building remembered what it used to promise. Roman stepped out alone. No bodyguards trailing him, no entourage, just him, his black coat soaking through within seconds, his shoes splashing through the gutter water as he crossed the street. He liked to do this. Walk into a problem himself, look it dead in the eye, let people see exactly who they were dealing with. It had worked every time. It had built his reputation brick by brick, fear by fear. The bell rang as he pushed the door open. Elena was wiping down the counter, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair pulled back in a knot that had mostly come undone over the course of a long night. She glanced up, saw the tailored coat, the expensive watch, the way he carried himself like the whole world owed him rent, and she knew immediately who he was. South Boston wasn't a big place. Everyone knew Roman Valenti's face the way everyone knows a storm cloud on the horizon. "We're closed," she said, same flat tone she'd used on Sal. "I'm not here to buy a roast." "Then you're here to waste my time, and I don't have much of that to spare." She set the rag down and crossed her arms, and Roman noted, with the part of his brain that never stopped cataloging threats, that she didn't step back from the counter, didn't put distance between herself and the door. Most people, faced with him, instinctively retreated. She didn't move an inch. "You put one of my men on the ground tonight," Roman said, stepping closer, letting his voice drop into the register that made grown men sweat. "You understand what that means? You understand who I am?" "I understand exactly who you are," Elena said. "Spoiled rich boy who inherited a business built on terrifying people too poor to fight back. I'm guessing daddy issues, a mother who left early, and a closet full of suits that cost more than my rent. Am I close?" For a fraction of a second, so brief that anyone else would have missed it, something flickered behind Roman's gray eyes. Surprise. Maybe even something close to respect, buried so deep under 3 years of armor that he barely recognized the feeling himself. "You've got a mouth on you," he said. "And you've got a problem," Elena shot back, "because I'm not paying you a cent, and I'm not scared of you, and every threat your guy made tonight, I'm going to keep walking through like it's nothing. So either tell me why you're really here, or get out of my shop before it gets cold." Roman moved fast. Faster than she expected, faster than most men his size had any right to move. He came around the counter, grabbed her by the front of her apron, and slammed her back against the steel prep table hard enough to rattle the knives in their block. "You don't talk to me like that," he growled, his face inches from hers, the rainwater still dripping from his hair onto her collarbone. "Not in my city, not in my territory. I came here to scare some respect into you, and I will, one way or—" He never finished that sentence either. Elena's hand had already closed around the handle of the boning knife resting on the table beside her. The same blade she'd used to break down 100 carcasses, The blade her father had taught her to wield before he'd taught her to read, and in one motion, smooth as silk, terrifying as a held breath, she had it pressed flat against Roman Valenti's throat. The room went still. Rain hammered the window. The fluorescent light buzzed, and the most feared man in South Boston stood frozen, pinned against his own grip on her apron, a blade resting against his pulse with just enough pressure to remind him exactly how close he was to dying in a butcher shop that smelled like sawdust and old blood. "Let go of me," Elena said, voice low, even, not a single tremor in it, "or I'll show you exactly what I learned cutting up cows since I was 9 years old." Roman's eyes didn't leave hers. His hand was still fisted in her apron, his body still pressed close enough that he could feel her heartbeat, steady, infuriatingly steady, like she dealt death threats over breakfast. He should have been furious. He should have called for his men, should have ended this the way his father would have ended it. Instead, for the first time in 3 years, Roman Valenti felt something he hadn't let himself feel since he buried his old man. He felt outmatched. "You'd really do it," he said. Not a question. An observation, almost admiring, almost disbelieving. "Try me and find out." Slowly, deliberately, Roman released the apron and stepped back, hands raised slightly, not in surrender but in something closer to recognition. Predator acknowledging predator. Elena lowered the knife but didn't put it down, kept it loose in her grip, kept her eyes on him. "Most people," Roman said quietly, "when I walk into their place of business, they cry. They beg. They offer me their firstborn child if it'll make me leave. I'm not most people." "No," he said, and something in his voice had changed, lost its edge, turned almost thoughtful. "You're not." He looked at her properly then, really looked, the way he looked at a contract before he signed it, searching for the trap, the angle, the thing that didn't add up. A woman in her late 20s, exhausted around the eyes, hands rough and scarred from years of labor, standing in a shop that was barely staying afloat, who just held a knife to the throat of a man who could erase her entire existence with one phone call, and she hadn't so much as raised her voice. "What's your name?" he asked. "You already know it. Your guy said it before he came in here making threats." "I want to hear you say it." A beat passed. 2. The rain kept falling. "Elena Mercer." "Elena Mercer," Roman repeated like he was testing the weight of it, filing it away somewhere it would never be erased. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, or the smartest move anyone's made against me in 3 years. I haven't decided which yet." "Funny," Elena said, finally setting the knife down on the table between them, close enough that her hand could find it again in half a second. "I was about to say the same thing about you." Roman didn't leave. That surprised them both, though neither said it out loud. He pulled one of the 2 mismatched stools from behind the counter and sat down across from her like he had all night, like the rain outside wasn't his problem to deal with, like the empire waiting for him back at the penthouse could survive without him for 1 more hour. "Talk," he said. "Tell me why a woman who clearly knows how to use a knife is running a failing butcher shop instead of doing something that pays better. It's not failing. It's barely standing. I drove past it for years before tonight. I know what a dying business looks like, Ms. Mercer. I've put a few of them in the ground myself." Elena's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. "This was my father's shop. He built it from nothing, came over with 2 suitcases and a butcher's apprenticeship, and turned it into something that fed half this neighborhood for 30 years. He died 18 months ago. Heart attack standing right where you're sitting. I'm not letting people like you turn his life's work into a tax write-off for the Costello family." Something passed over Roman's face. Not quite sympathy. He didn't do sympathy, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. He knew what it was to inherit a dead man's legacy and carry it like a stone in your chest. "Your father," he said slowly. "Marcus Mercer." Elena's eyes narrowed. "How do you know his name?" Roman didn't answer right away. He studied her face, the way her shoulders had gone rigid, the way her hand had drifted back toward the knife without her even realizing it. "Because," he said finally, "your father's name came up in files my father kept locked in a safe most people in the city don't know exists. Files about men who used to know everyone's secrets. Men who could make problems disappear without ever picking up a weapon. There was a fixer who worked this city for 30 years, untouchable, trusted by every family from here to Providence, who knew where every body was buried, literally in some cases. My father called him the Butcher, not because of what he did during the day. The blood drained slowly from Elena's face, though she fought to keep her expression steady. "You're lying." "I never lie about business," Roman said. "Lying about business gets people killed, and usually it's me doing the killing. So no, Ms. Mercer, I'm not lying. Your father wasn't just cutting meat in this shop for 30 years. He was running information for half the organized crime in this city, and he was good enough at it that even my father, a man who trusted nobody, trusted him." Elena's hand finally closed around the knife handle, not in threat this time, but like she needed something solid to hold on to. "He never told me any of that." "Would you have believed him?" She didn't answer. The rain kept falling outside, softer now, like the storm itself was listening, waiting to see what she'd do with the truth that had just been dropped on the cutting board between them. "There's a reason he taught you the way he did," Roman continued, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, voice losing its threat and gaining something almost gentle, almost careful. An emotion Roman Valenti hadn't allowed himself in years. Anatomy, pressure points, how to disable a man twice your size without breaking a sweat. "You think that's standard butcher training? My men have killed people with less skill than what you just showed me holding a knife to my throat." He said it was for protection, so I'd never be helpless. "He was preparing you," Roman said, "for exactly this kind of night." Elena stood up abruptly, pacing behind the counter, running her hands through her hair, trying to make sense of 18 months of grief reshaping itself into something stranger, darker, heavier. Her father, quiet, gentle, smelling of sawdust and aftershave, who used to hum old songs while he worked, who'd never raised his voice at her in her whole life, had been something else entirely behind that quiet exterior. A man who held secrets that could topple empires. "If what you're saying is true," she said slowly, turning back to face him, "then somewhere in this shop there might be records, files, things your father wanted, things other families would kill to find." Roman's eyes sharpened, the predator returning behind the gray. "Now you're starting to understand the situation you're actually in." "And what situation is that?" He stood, closing the distance between them again. But this time there was no threat in it, only a strange electric tension that neither of them had a name for yet. "You're not just a woman who refused to pay protection money," Roman said quietly. "You're sitting on information that half this city has been trying to find for years. Information that could end the Costello family, or save it, depending on who finds it first. And as of tonight, everyone who matters in this city is going to know your name." Elena felt the floor shift under her, felt the entire shape of her life rearrange itself in the space of one conversation. 18 months of mourning a quiet butcher had just become something else. Mourning a man who'd lived a double life, who'd left her holding a knife in one hand and a loaded gun of secrets in the other. "So what do you want from me?" she said, voice steadier than she felt. Roman studied her for a long moment, the rain drumming against the window, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead like it too was holding its breath. "I want," he said slowly, "to make you an offer you'd be a fool to refuse, and dangerous enough that I half expect you to put that knife back at my throat before I finish saying it. Try me." And for the first time since he'd walked through that door soaked to the bone and ready to make an example of her, Roman Valenti almost smiled. "There's a traitor inside my organization," he said. "Someone feeding information to the Irish syndicate, costing me shipments, costing me men, costing me everything my father built, and everything I've bled to protect since he died. I don't know who it is. I don't know how deep it goes. But your father's files, if they exist, if you can find them, might be the only thing in this city that can tell me the truth before it costs me everything." Elena's grip on the knife tightened. "And why would I help you? You walked in here an hour ago threatening to burn this place to the ground." "Because," Roman said, voice dropping low, almost rough with something he didn't bother naming, "if I don't find this traitor, the war that's coming will burn through this entire neighborhood. Every shop on this street, every family living above them, every kid playing stickball in that alley out there. None of it survives what's coming if I lose control of my own house. You want to protect this neighborhood? This is how you do it, not with a knife. With the truth your father left buried somewhere in these walls." Silence stretched between them, thick and dangerous, full of everything neither of them was ready to say out loud. Outside, the rain finally began to ease, the storm moving on to terrorize some other part of the city, leaving behind only the wet glow of streetlights reflecting off the cracked pavement. Elena looked down at the knife still gripped in her hand. The same knife, the same blade, that had been pressed against the throat of the most dangerous man in South Boston less than an hour ago. She thought about her father's calloused hands teaching her to debone a chicken, teaching her pressure points, teaching her how to read a room full of strangers and know exactly who meant her harm. She thought about 30 years of secrets hidden somewhere in this building, waiting, patient, dangerous. She thought about a neighborhood that had already lost too much, and a man standing in front of her offering a deal that could either save it or destroy what little remained of her quiet, careful, exhausting life. "If I help you," Elena said finally, voice low but unshaking, "I need guarantees. Real ones. Every small business on this street stays protected. No fees, no threats, no exceptions. And if I find what you're looking for, I decide what happens with it, not you." Roman studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind those cold gray eyes, something that hadn't moved in years. "Done," he said. "That's it? Just like that?" "I don't waste time negotiating with people I respect," Roman said, and for the first time since walking through that door, his voice carried no threat at all, only something colder and more dangerous than threat, certainty. "And Ms. Mercer, you've earned more respect in the last hour than most men in my organization earn in a decade." He extended his hand across the counter. Elena looked at it for a long moment, knife still resting in her other palm, the weight of her father's secrets pressing down on her chest like a stone she hadn't known she was carrying until tonight. Outside, the rain finally stopped completely, leaving the street slick and silent and waiting. Elena set the knife down on the cutting board between them, slow, deliberate, a decision rather than a surrender, and shook Roman Valenti's hand. Neither of them said it out loud, but both of them felt it in that handshake, the quiet click of two dangerous lives locking together, the first thread in a partnership that would either save this entire neighborhood or burn it to ash trying. Behind them, somewhere in the walls of a butcher shop that had survived 30 years of secrets, a hidden truth waited to be uncovered. And neither Elena nor Roman yet understood that the traitor they were both hunting was already closer to this counter, closer to this handshake, than either of them could have imagined. The bell above the door rang one final time as Roman stepped back out into the wet Boston night, and Elena stood alone in her father's shop, staring down at her own palm, wondering exactly what she'd just agreed to, and whether her father, wherever he was, would be proud of her or terrified for her. She didn't know yet that this single night, one knife, one handshake, one impossible decision, had just set in motion a war that would shake the entire city to its foundations. And somewhere across town, in the shadows of an organization built on blood and silence, a traitor who'd just learned Elena Mercer's name began making plans of his own. 3 days passed before Roman Valenti set foot in the butcher shop again, and in those 3 days, Elena didn't sleep more than 6 hours total. She told herself it was the cleaning jobs eating her schedule alive, the early mornings scrubbing some banker's marble floors on Beacon Hill, the late nights cutting brisket until her forearms shook. She told herself it had nothing to do with the words the butcher rattling around in her skull like a loose tooth she couldn't stop tonguing. She found the first file on the second night, behind a false panel in the walk-in cooler her father had built himself 20 years ago, the kind of carpentry job that looked like nothing more than bad insulation work unless you knew exactly where to press. Inside, a metal box rusted at the corners, containing photographs, ledgers, names she didn't recognize, and one she did, Costello, written in her father's careful handwriting, dated 11 years back, next to a dollar figure that made her sit down hard on an overturned crate in the cold and just breathe for a while. She hadn't told Roman about the box yet. Some stubborn, bruised part of her wanted to know what she was holding before she handed any of it over. The bell rang at 9:45, after close, and she knew before she looked up that it was him. Nobody else walked like they owned the sidewalk underneath them. "You look like hell," Roman said, stepping in, shaking rain off his shoulders even though tonight the sky was clear. Just habit, she figured. A man who expected weather to turn on him no matter what the forecast said. "Thanks. You always open with compliments?" "I open with the truth. Saves time." He glanced around the shop, taking in the dim lights, the empty display case, the faint copper smell of a day's worth of cutting that never fully left the air. You find anything? Maybe. Maybe's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting tonight. Elena wiped down the counter with more force than the job required, not looking at him. I need to know I'm not handing you a loaded gun pointed at my own head. Roman's jaw tightened. He crossed to the counter, set both hands flat on the steel, leaned in just enough that she could smell rain and cigarettes and something underneath that. Exhaustion, the same bone-deep tired she recognized because she wore it every day herself. You think I'm here to screw you over? I think I held a knife to your throat 3 nights ago and you're still walking around free, which means either you're stupider than your reputation suggests or you want something bad enough to swallow your pride over it. I'm betting on the second one. So yeah, I'm careful. Careful's smart, Roman said. Careful's also going to get you killed if you wait too long deciding who to trust in this. You think the traitor in my organization doesn't already know your name? You think Sal Bruno walked away from this shop with his throat bruised and didn't tell every soldier in a 5-block radius that the Mercer girl put him on the floor? Word travels in this business, Elena. It travels fast, and it travels ugly. She froze for half a second at the sound of her first name in his mouth. He'd never used it before. It landed strange, too intimate for a man who'd come within an inch of breaking her wrist 3 nights ago. Don't, she said. Don't what? Don't say my name like you've earned the right to. Something flickered across his face. Not quite anger, something closer to surprise that she'd called it out at all. Most people didn't push back on him twice in one conversation, let alone over something as small as a name. Fine, he said, voice clipped. Miss Mercer, better? Much. A long silence stretched between them, the fluorescent light buzzing its same nervous hum overhead. Roman straightened up, ran a hand through his hair, and for a moment looked less like the head of a crime family and more like a man who hadn't slept properly in 3 years, which, she would learn later, was exactly true. I lost another shipment last night, he said finally, voice flat, controlled in the way that told her controlling it was costing him something. 40 kilos, gone, intercepted at the docks before my men even got within a mile of the drop point. Somebody told the Irish exactly where and when. That's the 3rd one this month. You know what that cost me? Not just money. Trust. Every captain under me is starting to look sideways at every other captain. Nobody knows who to believe anymore. And an organization that doesn't trust itself is an organization 6 months from a civil war that's going to spill into streets just like this one. So find the leak yourself. You don't need me for that. I've had 2 men running internal investigations for 5 weeks. Both of them came up empty. Either the traitor's smarter than my best people or... He stopped himself. Or one of your best people is the traitor, Elena finished. Roman didn't answer. That silence said more than any confession could have. The box stayed hidden 3 more days. Elena told herself it was caution. Really, it was fear. The kind that creeps in slow and makes a home in your chest before you even notice it's moved in. Because the deeper she dug through her father's ledgers at night, after the shop closed and the street outside went quiet, except for the occasional siren. 2 neighborhoods over, the more she understood that her father hadn't just known secrets. He'd traded in them. He'd built relationships with men on every side of every conflict this city had seen in 3 decades. Men who were now dead, in prison, or sitting in penthouses just like Roman's, still pulling strings. And buried in page after page of careful, slanted handwriting, she found something that made her blood run cold. A name that appeared again and again in transactions tied to the Costello family, going back almost a decade. A name connected to payoffs, to information sold quietly to whoever paid best. A name she recognized now because she'd heard Roman say it with something close to affection 2 days earlier, mentioning a man who'd been at his father's funeral, who'd practically raised him after his own mother left. Dominic Reyes. Roman's head of security. The man Roman trusted with his life every single day. Elena sat at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning with that page spread out in front of her, and she didn't know what scared her more. The possibility that she was wrong, or the possibility that she was right and would have to be the one to tell him. She found Roman's penthouse without needing to ask for the address. Everyone in this city knew where the Valenti family kept its crown. The doorman recognized her face. Word traveled fast, just like Roman had said, and led her up without a single question, which told her something about how quickly her name had already spread through circles she'd never wanted to be part of. Roman opened the door himself, sleeves rolled up, top button of his shirt undone, a tumbler of something amber in his hand that he hadn't touched in a while based on how the ice had melted down to slivers. "This is new," he said. "You coming to me instead of the other way around. We need to talk, somewhere private. It's 2 in the morning. I know what time it is." Her voice had an edge to it that made him step back and let her in without further argument. The penthouse was exactly what she expected, and somehow nothing like it. Cold marble, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that owed this man fear, but also, scattered in places he probably thought no one would notice, small evidence of a life underneath the empire. A framed photograph on a side table, faded, of a younger Roman standing next to a woman who must have been his mother, both of them smiling in a way Elena had never once seen on his face. A chess set with pieces arranged mid-game, like he played alone sometimes, against himself, because there was no one left he trusted enough to sit across the board from. "Talk," Roman said, closing the door behind her. Elena pulled the folded page from her jacket and set it on the marble counter between them, the same gesture she'd used with the knife 3 nights ago, laying down something dangerous, deliberate, irreversible. "I found my father's records on the Costello family's payment history. There's a name in there that shows up too many times to be a coincidence." Roman picked up the page. She watched his eyes move down the lines, watched the exact moment the muscle in his jaw started to twitch, watched the tumbler of melted ice slip slightly in his grip before he set it down hard enough to crack against the marble. "This is wrong," he said. "I thought you might say that." "No." Roman's voice rose, sharper than she'd heard it yet, and for the first time since they'd met, Elena saw something close to real, unguarded fear cross his face. "You don't understand. Dominic's been with this family longer than I've been alive. He carried my father's casket. He taught me how to shoot a gun when I was 11 years old because my father was too busy running an empire to bother. This can't be right. I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm telling you what's written in 11 years of my father's ledgers, in his own handwriting, with dates and dollar amounts that line up exactly with every shipment your organization's lost in the last decade." Roman slammed his hand flat against the counter, the sound cracking through the silent apartment like a gunshot, and Elena's body tensed automatically, every muscle ready to move, ready to defend, even standing in the home of the man who'd hired her for exactly this kind of information. "You think I don't know what it looks like?" Roman snapped. "You think I haven't run every scenario in my head 100 times since you handed me this? But Dominic's the one man in this whole organization who's never once given me a reason to doubt him. He's the one who told me to be careful around you. He's the one who said this whole alliance was a mistake from the start, that I shouldn't be trusting some butcher's daughter with information that could burn my entire operation to the ground." The words landed like a slap. Elena's spine straightened, her chin lifted, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped into the same dangerous calm she'd used the night she put a knife to his throat. "So that's what this is. You came running to me with a problem you couldn't solve yourself, made promises about protecting my neighborhood, shook my hand like it meant something. And the second I bring you an answer you don't like, suddenly I'm just some butcher's daughter who can't be trusted." "That's not what I said." "It's exactly what you said." She stepped closer, close enough now that he could see the exhaustion carved into the skin under her eyes, the 3 sleepless nights, the weight of a dead father's secrets she hadn't asked to inherit. "You want to know something, Roman? My father spent 30 years keeping secrets for men exactly like you. Men who used him when it was convenient and looked at him sideways the second the truth got uncomfortable. He died with a heart that gave out from carrying all of it. And you know what I learned watching him do that? I learned that loyalty to men like you is a one-way street that runs straight into a grave. Don't talk about something you don't understand. I understand plenty. I understand that you'd rather believe the man who taught you to shoot a gun than believe the evidence sitting right in front of you, because believing me means admitting you've been wrong about somebody you loved for years. That's not strategy, Roman. That's fear. And fear's going to get more of your people killed than any traitor ever could." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Roman stood with his hands braced against the counter, breathing hard, staring down at the page like it might rearrange itself into something less devastating if he looked at it long enough. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its edge, replaced by something rawer, something closer to the man underneath 3 years of armor. "If you're wrong about this, he said quietly. It doesn't just cost me money. It costs me the one person who stood by me since I was a kid with a dead mother and a father who looked at me like I was a disappointment he was stuck raising. You understand what you're asking me to risk? I understand exactly what I'm asking, Elena said, and for a moment her own anger cracked just enough to let something gentler through. I'm not asking you to believe me blindly. I'm asking you to look closer before somebody else gets killed because you were too scared to check. Roman didn't answer right away. He picked up the page again, read it a second time, a third, and Elena watched 3 years of carefully constructed control fight against something much older. A boy who'd lost his mother, who'd spent his whole life trying to prove to a dead father that he was strong enough to hold an empire together, now staring down the possibility that the one person who'd ever made him feel safe had been lying to him the entire time. Get out, he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. Roman, I said get out. His eyes snapped up, and there was something dangerous in them now, something that reminded her exactly why this man's name made grown soldiers go pale. I need to think, and I can't do that with you standing here making me doubt 30 years of my life. Elena held his gaze for a long moment, then folded the page back up and slid it across the counter toward him. Keep it, she said. When you're done being angry at me for telling you the truth, you're going to need it. She left without another word, and behind her, Roman Valenti stood alone in his penthouse at 3 a.m, staring at a piece of paper that threatened to unravel everything he thought he understood about the only family he had left. Dominic Reyes had a face built for trust. Deep lines around the eyes from decades of squinting into Boston winters, a gray-streaked beard he kept neat, and a way of speaking that made people feel like they were being looked after rather than managed. He was 61 years old, built like a man who'd spent his youth doing manual labor and never quite lost the muscle, even as the years softened his middle, and he'd been at Roman's side, in one capacity or another, since Roman was 7 years old, and his mother had walked out the front door of the Valenti estate without so much as a goodbye. Roman summoned him to the penthouse 2 days later, after 48 hours of barely sleeping, of staring at his mother's old photograph until the edges blurred, of running every memory he had of Dominic through a filter of suspicion that made his stomach turn. You wanted to see me, Dominic said, settling into the chair across from Roman's desk like he'd done 1,000 times before, completely at ease in a way that either meant he was innocent or meant he was exactly as good at this game as 11 years of careful betrayal would require. We've lost 3 shipments this month, Roman said, keeping his voice level, watching Dominic's face for any flicker, any crack. I know. I've been running it down myself. Whoever's leaking the information, they're being careful. Could take weeks to nail it down. Could it? Roman leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, the same posture his father used to take right before he destroyed somebody across a negotiating table. Funny thing about weeks, Dominic, that's a long time for a man as good as you to come up empty. Something shifted in Dominic's expression. Subtle, almost nothing. But Roman had spent his whole life learning to read the smallest movements in men's faces, and he saw it. A flicker of caution where there should have been only confusion. What's this about, Roman? You tell me. I don't know what you're... 11 years, Roman said, voice dropping low, dangerous. That's how long the records show payments going back. 11 years of information sold to the highest bidder, dressed up as bad luck and bad timing. You taught me how to shoot a gun, Dominic. You stood next to me at my father's funeral, and the whole time you've been bleeding this family dry from the inside. Dominic's face went through several emotions in quick succession. Shock, then something that looked almost like genuine hurt, before settling into a careful, controlled neutrality that did nothing to ease the cold knot forming in Roman's chest. Whoever showed you that, Dominic said slowly, they're lying to you, or they're being lied to themselves. I've given 30 years of my life to this family. You think I'd throw that away for money? I think, Roman said, standing up now, circling the desk slowly, that I don't know what to think anymore. And that scares me more than any traitor in this organization ever could. The 2 men stood facing each other in the dim light of the penthouse. Decades of trust hanging between them like a thread stretched to its absolute limit, and neither of them noticed the small recording device clipped beneath the underside of the coffee table, planted there 2 days earlier by a third man who had far more to lose than either of them realized. The man who'd planted that device sat in a dimly lit apartment across town. 3 different burner phones spread across a cluttered table, listening to the conversation play back through a cheap earpiece with a satisfaction that bordered on giddy. His name didn't matter yet. Wouldn't matter, not until the very end when the truth finally cracked open like a skull under a blunt object. But for now, he existed only as a shadow moving through Roman Valenti's organization, close enough to be trusted, distant enough to never be suspected. He'd spent years building this position. Years of small favors, careful loyalty, perfectly timed absences whenever something needed to go wrong. And now, finally, watching Roman tear his own organization apart from the inside, watching the one relationship Roman trusted more than any other start to fracture under the weight of manufactured suspicion, it was almost beautiful, almost poetic. He dialed a number that connected to a phone 3 states away, in the hands of a man who answered with nothing but silence, waiting. "It's working," the shadow man said quietly. "He's turning on Reyes. The girl's information is doing exactly what we hoped it would. Give it another week, maybe 2, and Roman Valenti is going to destroy the only loyal man he has left, all by himself, with his own hands. And once Reyes is gone, once the one man who could actually protect this organization is out of the picture, then we move," the voice on the other end said, "and there won't be anyone left standing between us and everything Valenti's father built." The line went dead. The shadow man leaned back in his chair, smiling at the ceiling, while 2 miles away Roman Valenti and Dominic Reyes stood locked in a standoff. Neither of them fully understood the true cost of yet. Elena didn't hear from Roman for 5 days after she walked out of his penthouse. 5 days of working the cleaning route at dawn, the butcher shop at dusk, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind stayed tangled in everything she'd uncovered. Her father's double life, the weight of secrets that had apparently gotten him killed slowly over 30 years, even if it was technically a heart attack that took him, and the question of whether she'd just handed Roman Valenti a weapon that would tear his entire world apart, justly or not. On the 6th day, she found her shop's back door forced open. She noticed it the second she stepped into the alley behind Mercer and Son. The heavy steel door that should have been locked, standing ajar by half an inch. The kind of detail that wouldn't register to most people, but screamed at her like an alarm bell. She'd grown up in this building. She knew every sound it made, every shadow it cast, every inch of its geography down to the loose floorboard by the walk-in cooler. And right now, every instinct her father had drilled into her since childhood was screaming that something was deeply, dangerously wrong. She didn't call out. She didn't run. She moved the way her father had taught her, slow, silent, weight distributed evenly across the balls of her feet, breath controlled into a rhythm that wouldn't betray her position. The boning knife was already in her hand before she consciously decided to reach for it, pulled from the magnetic strip just inside the door, cool steel grounding her racing pulse into something usable. The shop was dark except for the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the front windows. She heard it before she saw it. A drawer sliding open somewhere in the back office. The soft rustle of paper, someone searching with practiced, careful hands. She rounded the corner into the back hallway and found a man in dark clothes, hunched over her father's old desk, flashlight clenched between his teeth, hands rifling through the files she'd pulled from the hidden cooler panel 3 nights ago, and foolishly left stacked in a drawer she'd thought was safe. Her breath caught. Every cell in her body screamed at her to retreat, to call for help, to do anything other than what she actually did, which was step fully into the doorway and say, in a voice far steadier than she felt, "Looking for something?" The man's head snapped up. He was younger than she expected, maybe late 20s, with the kind of nervous energy that told her this wasn't a professional, not really. Somebody hired in a hurry, somebody desperate or paid just enough to take a stupid risk. He didn't hesitate. He lunged. What happened next took less than 11 seconds. Though later, replaying it in her mind at 3 in the morning, it would feel like it stretched into something much longer, an eternity measured in adrenaline and instinct. He swung the flashlight at her head. She ducked under it and drove her shoulder into his ribs, using his own forward momentum the way her father had taught her 100 times over a butcher's block, redirecting force instead of meeting it head-on. He staggered, gasping, and she followed with a strike to the side of his knee that buckled him sideways into the filing cabinet with a crash loud enough to rattle the windows. He came up swinging again, wild, desperate, and this time his fist connected with her jaw hard enough that she saw white for half a second, tasted copper, felt her own knife slip from her grip and skitter across the floor. Pain bloomed bright and immediate along her cheekbone, and for one terrifying instant her body wanted to freeze, wanted to curl inward and protect itself the way every untrained instinct screamed at her to do. She didn't let it. Calm hands cut clean. Panic just makes a mess. She drove her palm upward into his nose with everything she had left, felt cartilage give way under the impact, heard him scream and stumble back, blood pouring down over his mouth. And in the half-second of his disorientation, she grabbed the heavy iron meat tenderizer from the counter and swung it hard into the back of his shoulder, dropping him to his knees. "Who sent you?" she demanded, breathing hard, blood from her split lip dripping onto the tile floor between them. He didn't answer. He scrambled, half-blind with pain, toward the back door, and she let him go. Not out of mercy, but because chasing a desperate man through a dark alley with her own knife somewhere behind her on the floor was the kind of decision that got people killed, and she'd made enough reckless choices for one night already. She locked the door behind him with shaking hands, slid down against the cold steel of the walk-in cooler, and sat there in the dark for a long time, blood drying on her jaw, pulse hammering in her ears, finally letting herself shake the way she hadn't let herself shake 3 nights earlier in front of Roman Valenti. When she finally pulled out her phone and called him, her voice came out rougher than she intended. Someone broke into the shop. There was a pause on the other end, sharp and silent, before Roman's voice came back low and urgent in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." Elena. Her name again, but this time it didn't sound like a violation. It sounded like something closer to fear. "Are you hurt?" "He got a hit in. Split my lip. I'll live." She closed her eyes, leaned her head back against the cold metal door. "He was after the files, the ones I pulled from the cooler. Somebody knows what I found, Roman. Somebody knows, and they sent someone to make sure I never had the chance to show it to anybody else." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that she thought the call had dropped. "I'm coming," Roman said finally, voice tight with something raw and unguarded. "Don't move. Don't open that door for anyone but me." "Roman, I should have never let you walk out of my apartment angry," he said, words coming faster now, edged with something that sounded almost like guilt. "I should have put men on that shop the second you handed me that page. I was too busy being angry about Dominic to think straight, and now you're sitting there bleeding because of it. This isn't your fault." "It's exactly my fault." His voice cracked, just slightly, just enough for her to hear the man underneath the empire. "I'm 15 minutes out. Don't you dare move." He hung up before she could argue further, and Elena sat alone in the dark of her father's shop, blood drying on her chin, the iron tenderizer still clutched in her free hand, staring at the spot on the floor where her knife had skittered away from her for the first time in years, and understanding with a cold certainty that settled into her bones, that whatever fragile alliance she'd built with Roman Valenti had just stopped being a transaction. It had become something far more dangerous, something that could get them both killed. 15 minutes later, the back door rattled with 3 sharp knocks, and Roman Valenti's voice called through the steel, rougher than she'd ever heard it. "It's me. Open up." She rose on unsteady legs, and as she slid the bolt back and pulled the door open, she found him standing in the alley with no entourage, no bodyguards, his shirt collar still askew from however fast he'd thrown it on, his eyes immediately finding the dried blood along her jaw and going dark with something that looked dangerously close to fury barely held in check. "Who did this?" he said, voice low, lethal. "I don't know. He ran before I could ask twice." Roman stepped inside, scanning the wreckage of the back office. The overturned filing cabinet, the scattered papers, the small dark spots of blood on the tile that belonged to neither of them, but to the man who'd fled into the night with a broken nose and a story to tell whoever had sent him. He turned back to her, and for a moment the careful armor he wore every day cracked just enough to let something raw and human bleed through. "I almost lost you," he said quietly, and the words hung strange and heavy in the cold air of the shop, neither of them quite sure yet what to do with them. Elena didn't answer right away. She looked at him, really looked, the way she had the first night, cataloging the exhaustion, the fear he was trying and failing to hide, the blood pressure visibly hammering in the vein along his temple. And something in her chest shifted, something dangerous and unwelcome and impossible to ignore any longer. "It's not just my files they're after," she said finally, breaking the silence. "It's me. Whoever's behind this knows I'm the one piecing it together, which means Whoever set up Dominic, whoever's actually been feeding your shipments to the Irish for 11 years, they're watching us right now. They knew exactly when to send someone, exactly what to look for, exactly where to find it. Roman's jaw tightened, the fury in his eyes sharpening into something colder, more focused. Which means, he said slowly, either we've got a leak telling them everything we do, or... He stopped. Elena watched the realization land on his face in real time, watched the color drain slightly from his skin as a new and far more terrifying possibility settled into place. Or it's not Dominic at all, Elena finished for him. And whoever the real traitor is, they just used my father's name and your own paranoia to point you straight at the wrong man, while the actual snake stays close enough to watch everything unfold from the inside. The words hit the room like a dropped blade, sharp and final, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, both staring at the wreckage of a back office that suddenly felt less like a break-in and more like the opening move of a much larger, much darker game. One where the real enemy had been standing close enough to touch the whole time, patient, careful, and still completely invisible. Outside, the city moved on around them, indifferent and unaware, while inside a butcher shop that smelled of blood both old and new, Roman Valenti and Elena Mercer stood at the edge of a truth neither of them was ready to face. And the realization, dawning slow and cold between them, that there was no version of this story left where either of them could simply walk away. Roman didn't sleep that night. He posted 2 men he trusted with his actual life, not his organization, his life, a distinction that had only existed for him in a list of maybe 3 names total, outside the butcher shop, and he sat across from Elena at the small table in the back office until 4 in the morning, going through her father's files page by page under the weak light of a desk lamp, both of them too wired on adrenaline to feel the exhaustion yet. "This entry," Roman said, tapping a line near the bottom of a ledger page, voice rough from disuse. "March, 11 years ago, $15,000, no name attached, just initials, DR. Dominic Reyes. Or, Roman said slowly, somebody who wanted it to look like Dominic Reyes." Elena leaned across the table, close enough to see the page right side up, close enough that Roman caught the smell of her hair, copper, and rain, and something underneath that was just her, and he hated how much that distracted him in a room full of evidence that could end his entire world. "Look at the handwriting," she said. "My father wrote everything himself. Every entry in this ledger is his hand, consistent for 30 years. But this one," she traced her finger along the initials, "it's pressed harder. See how the D bleeds into the page more than the rest of the line. He was angry when he wrote this, or rushed, or both." Meaning maybe he wasn't recording a transaction he witnessed. Maybe he was recording an accusation somebody fed him. "My father didn't take payoff information at face value, Roman. He verified everything twice before it went in this book. Except this entry doesn't have a second source listed anywhere I can find. Every other page has cross-references, dates, witnesses, sometimes a second ledger number. This one's alone." Roman sat back slowly, rubbing both hands down his face, the stubble along his jaw scraping audibly in the silent room. "You're telling me Dominic might be innocent. I'm telling you the only piece of hard evidence against him doesn't hold up to the standard my father used for everything else in this book. Which means either your father's fixer made a mistake one time in 30 years, or somebody fed him false information 11 years ago, specifically so it would surface someday and point a finger at the wrong man. Why would anyone plan something 11 years in advance?" Elena looked up at him, and in the dim light her eyes had the particular sharpness of someone who'd spent too many nights with numbers and names, piecing together a puzzle that kept rearranging itself the deeper she dug. Because whoever's been feeding information to the Irish syndicate isn't some soldier who got greedy last year. This is patient. This is someone who's been playing a long game since before you ever took over this family. Someone who understood that someday somebody would go digging through these records, and they wanted the trail to lead somewhere safe, somewhere away from themselves. Roman's hand curled into a fist on the table, knuckles whitening. "If it's not Dominic, then it's somebody still standing close enough to you to watch every move we make," Elena finished. "Somebody who already knows I've been digging. Somebody who sent a man to this shop 2 nights ago to make sure these files disappeared before anyone could read them this carefully." The weight of that settled over the room like smoke. Roman stood, paced to the window, looked out at the alley where his two men stood smoking under the streetlight, oblivious to the storm building inside the building they were guarding. "I need to talk to Dominic," he said finally. "Tonight, before this goes any further." "Roman, if you're wrong about clearing him too fast—" "I'm not clearing him," Roman snapped, turning back, and there was something raw in his voice now, something that had been building for days. "I'm trying to undo the damage I already did by accusing a man who's been loyal to this family longer than you've been alive, based on evidence you're now telling me might be garbage. You understand what I did to him 2 days ago? I looked him in the eye and called him a traitor. I made him sit there and watch me doubt 30 years of his life over a piece of paper. If I was wrong about that—" "You don't know you're wrong yet," Elena said, standing too, voice firm. "You only know the evidence is shakier than we thought. That's not the same as innocent. Don't let guilt make you sloppy, Roman. That's exactly what got my father killed slow, trusting the wrong men because the alternative felt too painful to consider." Roman stared at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Anger, maybe, or something closer to recognition, the particular sting of being told a hard truth by someone who'd clearly already lived through learning it the hard way. "Fine," he said finally. "We do this together. We go to Dominic, we lay out everything, the inconsistency in the ledger, the break-in, all of it, and we watch his face while we do it. If he's guilty, somewhere in that conversation, he slips. And if he's not?" Roman's jaw tightened. "Then I owe him an apology I don't know how to give, and we're back to square one with the traitor still walking around free inside my organization." They found Dominic Reyes at his apartment in Charlestown, a modest 2-bedroom that looked nothing like the home of a man who'd supposedly been skimming 6 figures off his organization for over a decade. The furniture was old, comfortable, lived in. A recliner with a permanent dent in the cushion, photographs on the wall of Dominic with his late wife. Photographs of Roman as a child, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on Dominic's shoulders at what looked like a 4th of July barbecue 25 years gone. Dominic opened the door himself, already dressed despite the hour, like he hadn't been sleeping either. His eyes moved from Roman to Elena and back, and something tired and resigned settled into his expression. "Come to finish what you started the other day?" he said, voice flat. "We need to talk," Roman said. "All of us." Dominic stepped back to let them in, and the 3 of them stood in his small living room under the watchful eyes of photographs spanning 3 decades of loyalty, while Roman laid out everything: the ledger entry, the inconsistency Elena had found, the break-in at the shop, the strange precision of someone who'd known exactly where to look and exactly what to take. Dominic listened without interrupting, his weathered face giving away nothing until Roman finished, and then he was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his own hands, hands that had taught Roman to hold a gun steady when he was 11 years old and terrified of his own father. "You think I'd sell out this family," Dominic said finally, voice low, "and you waited until somebody broke into a butcher shop and assaulted this young woman before you started questioning whether the evidence even held up." "I'm sorry," Roman said, and Elena watched something in him crack open that she suspected hadn't cracked open in front of another human being in a very long time. "I should have looked closer before I came at you like that. You've never given me a reason to doubt you, and I let 3 days of fear make me forget that." Dominic's eyes were wet, though his voice stayed steady. 30 years, Roman. I carried your father's casket. I held you the night your mother walked out and you cried so hard you made yourself sick, and I never once told a living soul because I knew you'd hate that anybody saw you that broken. And the second somebody hands you a piece of paper with my initials on it, you're ready to believe I'd burn all of that down for money. I know, and I'm sorry, and it's not enough. But it's what I've got right now." The older man wiped a hand roughly across his face, composing himself, and when he spoke again his voice had steadied into something more useful. The voice of a man whose actual skill set was security, investigation, finding the threads other people missed. "If somebody planted that entry 11 years ago," Dominic said slowly, "they had to have access to whoever your father's fixer was reporting to. They had to know the information would eventually surface in a way that pointed at me specifically. That's not random. That means whoever did this knew, even back then, that someday there'd be a reckoning, and they wanted me sitting in the blast radius when it happened." "Who had that kind of access 11 years ago?" Elena asked. Dominic's face went very still, the the color draining slightly from his weathered skin. There's a short list, captains who were already established back then, people who'd have been trusted enough to be in rooms with information like that. He paused, swallowing hard. Marco Castellano, Tommy Russo, and... He stopped. And who? Roman pressed. Dominic looked up, and the fear in his eyes was a different kind than anything Elena had seen on him yet. Not fear for himself, but fear of what he was about to say, fear of the relationship it would shatter. Anthony Ricci, he said quietly. Your father's right hand for almost 15 years before he died. The man who trained half your current captains. The man who's been advising you since you took over, who sat in on every major decision you've made for the last 3 years. Roman went pale. Anthony's been loyal to this family since before I was born. So was I, as far as anyone knew 2 days ago, Dominic said, and the words landed with brutal, undeniable weight. They found Anthony Ricci at the social club on Hanover Street that the Costello family had used for 40 years as a meeting place, dressed up as a legitimate Italian social organization. Card games in the back room, espresso served by old women who'd been making it the same way since before Roman was born. The whole place smelling of cigar smoke and decades of careful business conducted under the cover of friendly conversation. Anthony was 68 years old, silver-haired, immaculately dressed even on an ordinary Tuesday night, the kind of man who carried himself with the unshakable confidence of someone who'd survived 4 decades in organized crime by being smarter and more patient than everyone around him. He sat at his usual table near the back, playing cards with 3 other old men. And when Roman walked in with Dominic and Elena trailing behind him, Anthony's face broke into a warm, easy smile that gave absolutely nothing away. Roman, he said, rising to embrace him, and Dominic, and... His eyes flicked to Elena with polite curiosity. I don't believe we've met. Elena Mercer, Roman said, watching Anthony's face carefully for any reaction to the name. There was none. Either Anthony was innocent, or he was the best liar Roman had ever encountered in his entire life, which, given the stakes, was a possibility that made Roman's stomach turn cold. Marcus Mercer's girl, Anthony said, and something flickered briefly behind his eyes. Recognition, but careful, controlled. I knew your father, good man, quiet, kept his word, which is rarer than you'd think in this business. That's actually why we're here, Roman said, gesturing toward an empty table in the corner, away from the other card players, away from prying ears. We need to talk, privately. Anthony's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened, calculating, and Roman felt the first cold thread of real suspicion settle into his chest as they sat down at the small table in the back of the club, the smell of espresso and cigar smoke thick around them. What's this about, Roman? 11 years ago, Roman said, watching every micro-expression on the old man's face with the focus of a man who'd learned to read danger in small movements long before he'd learned to read anything else. Somebody fed false information into my father's old fixer's records. Information designed to point suspicion at Dominic, here, for crimes someone else committed. We need to know who had access to plant something like that. Anthony's hands, resting on the table, went very still. It was a small thing. Most people wouldn't have noticed it at all. But Roman had spent 3 years learning exactly the kind of stillness that meant a man was choosing his next words with extreme care. That's a serious accusation to bring without proof, Anthony said slowly. We're not accusing you, Elena said, leaning forward, watching him with the same predatory patience she'd used the first night with Roman. We're asking who else had the access. You worked closely with my father for years. You'd know who he trusted with sensitive information, who could have gotten close enough to plant something like this without raising suspicion. Anthony was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between the 3 of them, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier warmth, replaced by something more careful, more guarded. Your father was a careful man, Elena. He didn't let many people close to his real work. Myself, occasionally. Dominic, sometimes, though usually only secondhand through Roman's father. And... He paused, and Roman watched something shift behind the old man's eyes, a decision being made in real time. There was one other, a young man, ambitious, eager to prove himself. He used to run errands for your father sometimes, Elena, back when he was barely more than a kid trying to work his way up in this business. Marcus trusted him with small things. Deliveries, mostly. But he was sharp. Sharp enough that I always wondered if he was paying closer attention than anyone realized. "Who?" Roman said, voice tight. Anthony's gaze settled on Roman with something that looked, for the first time all night, genuinely sad. "His name's Vincent Costello," Anthony said quietly. "Your cousin." The words hit the table like a dropped glass, shattering something that had been holding steady in the room for the entire conversation. Roman's face went through a series of expressions in quick succession: confusion, denial, and finally something that looked like the floor had genuinely opened up beneath him. "Vincent's been in Chicago for the last 8 years, Roman said, voice unsteady, "running the family's interests out there. He's barely set foot in Boston since my father's funeral." "Exactly," Anthony said, "far enough away to never be suspected, close enough, through family blood, to have access to information nobody would think to question. And ambitious enough, Roman, to have wanted exactly what you have. He was always angry, even as a boy, that the family business went to your father's line instead of his. I remember him at family gatherings, watching you with something that wasn't quite hatred, but wasn't far from it either. Children notice these things, even when adults pretend not to." Roman sat back hard in his chair, the breath leaving his body like he'd been struck. Elena watched him process it, watched 34 years of family history rearrange itself around a name he hadn't considered a threat in a decade. Watched the particular horror of realizing that the danger closest to you had been wearing the most familiar face the entire time. "He came back to Boston 3 weeks ago," Dominic said suddenly, his voice tight, eyes wide with the dawning horror of connecting dots that had been sitting in front of him the whole time. "I logged it myself. He said it was a family visit, said he wanted to pay respects at his uncle's grave on the anniversary. I didn't think anything of it. He's family, Roman. He had every right to come back without raising suspicion." 3 weeks, Roman repeated, voice hollow. "The shipment started disappearing 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed was the kind that physically pressed against the chest, thick and suffocating, full of every piece finally clicking into a shape none of them wanted to see. Anthony reached across the table and laid a weathered hand briefly on Roman's arm, an old man's gesture of comfort that did nothing to soften the devastation written across Roman's face. "I should have told you the moment I noticed him back in town," Anthony said quietly. "I told myself it was nothing. Family visiting family. I didn't want to be the man who turned the family against its own blood without proof. I'm sorry, Roman. That hesitation might have cost you more than either of us realizes yet." Roman stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor, several heads at nearby tables turning toward the noise before quickly looking away, the old instinct of men who'd spent their lives learning when not to notice things. "I need air," he said, voice rough, and walked out of the club without waiting for anyone to follow. Elena found him outside, leaning against the brick wall of the building, one hand pressed flat against the cold stone, breathing hard, his whole body coiled with a tension that looked one wrong word away from breaking something. A wall. A window. Himself. "Roman. Don't." His voice came out strangled. "Just give me a second." She gave him several. The street was quiet, the kind of late-night quiet that settles over a city when even the criminals have mostly gone home. And Elena stood a few feet away, watching him fight some internal battle she could only partially understand. The particular agony of learning that the danger inside your own family had been there for years, patient, watching, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. "He used to visit when I was a kid," Roman said finally, voice still rough, still unsteady. "Before his father, my uncle, got pushed out of the family business when I was maybe 10. There was a whole thing, a power struggle. My father came out on top, and Vincent's side of the family got sent to Chicago to run things out there as a consolation prize that everybody understood was really an exile. I remember Vincent being angry about it, even as a teenager. I remember him telling me once, half joking, that someday things would be different. I never thought—" He stopped, pressed his palm harder against the brick, knuckles whitening. "I never thought he'd spend a decade planning to destroy everything my father built. Everything I've spent 3 years trying to hold together. And the whole time, I was so focused on watching the people closest to me, I never once looked at the family member who had every reason in the world to want me gone." "You couldn't have known," Elena said. "I should have known." Roman turned to face her, and the look on his face was something she hadn't seen from him before. Not anger, not the cold control he wore like armor, but something closer to grief, raw and unguarded. I spent 3 years building walls around the people I trusted, terrified somebody close to me would betray the family. And I never once thought to look at blood, because blood was supposed to be the one thing that didn't lie, the one thing that didn't have a price tag. Blood lies all the time, Elena said quietly, and something in her voice made Roman look at her more closely, made him hear the weight underneath the words. My father spent 30 years protecting secrets for men who would have sold him out in a heartbeat if it served them better. Family doesn't mean loyalty, Roman. It just means proximity. Sometimes that's the most dangerous thing of all. Roman studied her for a long moment, the city lights catching the exhaustion and the steel underneath it in her eyes. And something in his chest shifted. Something that had nothing to do with the case, nothing to do with strategy or evidence or 11-year-old ledger entries, and everything to do with the fact that this woman, who'd had every reason to walk away from this mess a week ago, was still standing here in the cold at 1 a.m, helping him hold together an empire that wasn't even hers to save. "Why are you still here?" he asked quietly. "You got your deal, protection for the neighborhood, for your shop. You could have walked away the second you handed me that ledger page." "I could have," Elena agreed. "So why didn't you?" She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally answered, her voice had lost some of its usual steel, replaced by something more honest than either of them had allowed themselves yet. "Because somebody broke into my father's shop and put their hands on me trying to find those files. Because whoever's behind this, your cousin, apparently, doesn't care who gets hurt clearing his path to whatever he wants. And because I'm tired of watching men like that win just because the people standing in their way are too scared or too tired or too alone to keep fighting." She met his eyes directly. "My father fought quietly his whole life, and it still killed him slow. I'm done fighting quietly." Roman's hand moved before he fully decided to let it, reaching out, brushing his thumb gently along the faint yellow-green bruise still visible on her jaw from the break-in 3 nights earlier, a gesture so careful, so at odds with everything the world knew about Roman Valenti that Elena's breath caught despite herself. "I'm sorry you got pulled into this," he said quietly. "I'm not." The words surprised her as much as they surprised him. "I spent 18 months grieving a man I thought I understood completely, only to find out he was someone else entirely underneath the apron and the quiet voice. This," she gestured vaguely between them, at the club behind them, at the whole tangled mess of betrayal and blood and broken trust. "This is the closest I've come to actually understanding who he really was. I'm not sorry for that, even if it gets me killed." "Don't say that." "It's the truth." Roman's hand stilled against her jaw, and for a long, charged moment, neither of them moved, the cold January air doing nothing to cool the heat building between them. Two people who'd started this as strangers and somewhere in the last week had become something neither of them had a name for yet, something dangerous, something that felt like it might burn down everything around them if either of them gave it room to grow. The moment broke when Dominic stepped out of the club behind them, clearing his throat with the deliberate awkwardness of a man who'd absolutely seen what he'd just interrupted and chosen, out of decades of discretion, to pretend he hadn't. "Anthony's got more," Dominic said. "You're going to want to hear this." Back inside the club, Anthony was waiting with a folder he'd apparently retrieved from somewhere in the back office, his earlier warmth replaced by a grim, business-like focus that suggested he understood exactly how dangerous the next several minutes were about to become. "I did some checking while you two were outside," Anthony said, sliding the folder across the table. "Called in a few favors with people who track movement in and out of this city. Vincent's been seen at 3 separate locations in the last 2 weeks, all of them connected, directly or indirectly, to the Irish syndicate's known operations." Roman flipped open the folder, scanning surveillance photographs that made his stomach drop further with each page. Vincent Costello, his own cousin, meeting in dimly lit parking garages with men Roman recognized immediately as lieutenants in the rival organization that had been bleeding his family dry for months. "This isn't a coincidence anymore," Roman said, voice flat with disbelief. "It never was," Anthony said grimly. "But there's something else, something worse." He pulled out one final photograph, sliding it across the table with visible reluctance. "This was taken 4 days ago, outside your penthouse, Roman. The photograph showed Vincent Costello standing across the street from Roman's building, looking up at the windows with an expression that, even frozen in a grainy surveillance shot, radiated something cold and calculating. And standing beside him, deep in conversation, was a face Roman recognized instantly. A face that made the entire room tilt sideways beneath him. Sal Bruno. The man Elena had put on the floor of her butcher shop the very first night this whole nightmare began. The man who worked directly under Roman, who'd been in that shop on Roman's orders, who'd reported back about Elena's defiance and set this entire chain of events into motion. "Sal works for me," Roman said, voice barely above a whisper. "He's been with the organization for 6 years. He's the one who told me about Elena refusing to pay protection in the first place. And now he's meeting with your cousin in the middle of the night, 4 days before somebody broke into Miss Mercer's shop looking for exactly the kind of evidence that would expose this whole operation," Anthony said grimly. "I don't think that's a coincidence either, Roman. I think Sal's been reporting back to Vincent the entire time. I think the night he walked into that butcher shop demanding protection money wasn't really about protection money at all. I think Vincent already knew about your father's old fixer, already suspected Marcus Mercer kept records somewhere, and sent Sal in specifically to provoke a confrontation that would draw your attention to that shop. Elena's blood went cold as the full shape of it assembled itself in front of her, every piece sliding into place with horrifying precision. The confrontation hadn't been random. Sal hadn't simply been collecting protection money and gotten unlucky running into a woman who knew how to fight. He'd been sent, deliberately, to provoke exactly the kind of incident that would draw Roman Valenti himself into that shop, into contact with Elena Mercer, into proximity with files that Vincent Costello had spent years waiting to surface. "They used me," Elena said slowly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "From the very first night. They knew about my father's records. They wanted Roman to find out, wanted him to come to me, wanted this entire investigation to happen exactly the way it did. Because somewhere in their plan, all of this leads them exactly where they want us." "Where?" Roman said, his voice gone dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded violence in men like him. Anthony's face had gone pale, the weight of what he was about to say visible in every line of his aged face. "I think," he said slowly, "Vincent wanted you distracted, wanted you chasing Dominic, chasing ghosts, chasing 11-year-old ledger entries while he positioned himself for something much bigger. And I think the break-in at the shop wasn't really about stealing the files at all." "Then what was it about?" "I think it was a test," Anthony said, "to see how far Ms. Mercer would go to protect what she found, to see how close you'd let yourself get to her in the process of protecting her. Because a man who spent a decade planning a takeover doesn't just want to destroy your organization, Roman. He wants to destroy you. And the fastest way to break a man like you, a man who spent 3 years building walls so nobody could ever hurt you the way your father's empire hurt your mother, is to give you something worth losing and then take it away in front of you." The silence that followed was absolute. Roman's hands had curled into fists on the table, his breathing gone shallow and controlled in the specific way of a man holding back something enormous and dangerous. Elena felt the floor of her understanding shift entirely. Felt, with sick, dawning horror, that every step of the last week, every late night, every shared confidence, every moment of growing trust between herself and Roman Valenti might have been exactly what someone else had engineered from the very beginning. "If that's true," Elena said, voice unsteady for the first time in days, "then we're not chasing the traitor anymore. We're walking exactly where he wants us, and we don't even know what's waiting at the end of the path." Roman looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her chest tighten, with real fear for the first time since this entire nightmare began. Not fear of Vincent, not fear of the Irish syndicate, not even fear for his organization, but fear for her, sharp and immediate and entirely unguarded. "Then we need to know what he actually wants," Roman said, voice low, lethal. "Because if Anthony's right, if all of this was designed to get us exactly here, exactly now," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Because at that exact moment, Dominic's phone began ringing, loud and sharp in the tense silence of the club, and when he answered it, his face went the color of old ash within seconds, his hand beginning to shake around the device. "What?" Roman demanded. "What is it?" Dominic lowered the phone slowly, his eyes finding Elena's with something close to horror. It's one of the men I posted outside the butcher shop, he said, voice barely steady. He says there are armed men moving into position around the building right now. He says it doesn't look like a robbery. He says, Dominic's voice cracked. He says it looks like they're not there for the shop at all. He says they're going in to make sure nobody who's in there walks out. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Elena's stomach dropped through the floor, ice flooding through her veins as she realized, with horrifying clarity, exactly who Vincent's men would expect to find inside that shop at this hour. The place where this entire war had started. The place that held the only physical evidence connecting everything together. The place where, even now, 3 of her father's old hidden files sat unguarded, except for 2 men who'd just been ambushed before they could even radio a proper warning. Roman was already moving, grabbing his coat, his face transformed into something cold and lethal that Elena hadn't seen since the very first night he'd walked into her shop, intending to make an example of her. We need to go, now. Roman, if they're already in position, then we're already out of time, he said, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the door. Dominic and Anthony scrambling to follow, the warmth of the social club giving way to the brutal cold of the Boston night, as all 4 of them burst out onto the empty street, racing toward cars, toward weapons, toward a shop that held everything they'd uncovered, and everyone Elena had left in this world to lose. And somewhere across the city, in the flickering fluorescent light of Mercer and Sun, armed men were already moving silently through the shadows of the alley, closing in on the back door that had been forced open once already this week. Not to search this time, but to make absolutely certain that whatever secrets remained inside that building never had the chance to surface again, and that anyone unfortunate enough to be standing in the way of that goal would not be walking out alive. The car ate the distance between Hanover Street and Dorchester in under 6 minutes, Roman's hands white-knuckled on the wheel, running 2 red lights without slowing, the engine screaming as he cut across lanes with a recklessness that would have terrified Elena under any other circumstances. Right now, all she felt was the same cold, focused calm that had carried her through every crisis of her adult life, the one her father had built into her one cut, one lesson, one quiet correction at a time. Talk to me, Roman said, eyes locked on the road, jaw tight enough to crack teeth. Tell me there's another way in besides the front and the alley. There's a delivery hatch, Elena said, already pulling her hair back into a tight knot with hands that didn't shake despite everything. Underground runs from the basement to a grate under the sidewalk 2 buildings down. My father used it for deliveries before the street got repaved and the city made him switch to the alley entrance. Most people don't even know it's there anymore. Can you get to it without being seen? If we come up through the Choi family's restaurant basement 2 doors down, Mrs. Choi's owed my father favors for 15 years. She'll let me through without asking questions. Roman's knuckles flexed against the wheel. That's good. That's a way in. But Elena... He glanced at her, just for a second, just long enough for her to see the fear underneath the fury. If there are armed men already in position, going in quiet doesn't mean staying alive. It means we might get one shot at surprise before everything goes loud. Then we make the shot count. Dominic's car screeched up behind them as they parked 2 blocks short of the shop, lights off, engine cut. Anthony climbed out slower than the rest, his 68-year-old joints protesting the speed of everything happening around him, but his eyes were sharp, alert, scanning the rooftops and alley mouths with the practiced caution of a man who'd survived 4 decades in this business by never once underestimating what waited in the dark. 2 men, Dominic said quietly, checking the chamber of a handgun Elena hadn't even seen him produce. Posted at the corner of Mercer's building, no uniforms, trying too hard to look casual. Amateurs would call that subtle. I call it a flashing sign. Vincent wouldn't send amateurs, Roman muttered. No, Anthony agreed grimly, which means these 2 are just the outer ring. There's more inside already, and probably a couple more we haven't spotted yet, watching the perimeter from somewhere with a sightline. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands stayed steady as she led them in a wide arc around the block, hugging the shadows of buildings she'd known her entire life, every crack in the sidewalk, every flickering streetlight as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. The Choi family's restaurant was dark, closed for the night, but the side door gave easily under Elena's quiet knock, and Mrs. Choi's face appeared in the gap, lined with 60 years of a hard life, eyes widening at the sight of Elena's company. Trouble, the old woman said. It wasn't a question. Bad trouble, Elena confirmed. I need the basement passage. Now! Mrs. Choi didn't hesitate. She stepped back, ushering all four of them through the dim kitchen, down a narrow staircase that smelled of ginger and old grease, to a heavy wooden door set into the back wall that hadn't been opened in years, the hinges groaning in protest as Elena forced it wide enough to slip through. Be careful, child, Mrs. Choi whispered, pressing something cold and metal into Elena's palm before she descended. An old kitchen cleaver, worn smooth from decades of use. Your father gave me this for protection 30 years ago. Time to give it back, I think. The underground passage was narrow, cold, smelling of damp brick and decades of undisturbed dust, just wide enough for them to move single file with Elena leading, her free hand trailing along the wall to guide her through darkness her eyes hadn't adjusted to yet. Roman moved close behind her, his breathing controlled but audible, his hand occasionally brushing her shoulder in the dark, an unconscious tether between them as they moved deeper toward the building that held everything either of them had left to lose. How much further? Roman whispered. 20 feet, maybe less. Elena's fingers found the cold iron rungs of a ladder bolted into the brick, leading up to a trapdoor she knew sat beneath a section of loose flooring in her father's basement storage room. This comes up under the old grain sacks. Should be enough cover to get a look before anyone sees us. She climbed first, every muscle coiled tight, every breath measured and controlled despite the violent hammering of her heart, and pressed her palm flat against the wooden trapdoor above her, easing it upward an inch at a time, listening, waiting, every cell in her body screaming at her to move faster, even as years of training kept her deliberate and slow. Through the gap, she could see the dim shape of her father's basement, undisturbed, and beyond it, the thin line of light bleeding under the door that led up into the main shop, and the unmistakable sound of boots on tile, more than one set, moving with the careful, deliberate pace of men searching a building room by room. She eased the trapdoor fully open and climbed through, Roman following close behind, then Dominic, then Anthony last, the older man moving slower but no less determined, his weathered hand never straying far from the weapon tucked into his waistband. 3 voices, Roman breathed, barely audible. Maybe 4. They're searching the front of the shop. My files are in the back office, Elena whispered. If they find that drawer... They're not looking for files, Dominic murmured grimly, checking his own weapon with hands that had gone perfectly steady despite everything. Anthony's source was clear. They're here to make sure nobody walks out. The files are secondary. We're the target. Elena's blood ran cold, but underneath the fear something harder settled into place. The same cold clarity that had carried her through every dangerous moment of the last 2 weeks. The voice of her father steady in her memory. Calm hands cut clean. Panic just makes a mess. There's a fire exit by the walk-in cooler, she whispered. If we can draw them toward the front of the shop, 2 of us can circle around and come at them from behind. That's suicide, Roman hissed. That's the only play we've got, Elena shot back, voice barely above a breath but sharp enough to cut. You want to wait here in the dark until they find this basement too? We move now, or we don't move at all. Roman's jaw tightened, and for a long, charged second, Elena watched him war with every instinct that told him to protect her, to keep her safe behind him no matter the cost, and watched him lose that war to the cold, practical truth she'd just laid out in front of him. Fine, he said finally, voice low and lethal. Dominic, Anthony, you take the front, draw their attention toward the display counters. Elena and I circle through the cooler, come up behind whoever's covering the back hallway. Roman, Dominic started. We don't have time to argue logistics, Roman snapped. Move. They split in the dark, Dominic and Anthony melting toward the front of the shop with the kind of silent, practiced movement that spoke to decades spent in exactly this kind of violence, while Roman and Elena pressed themselves against the cold steel of the walk-in cooler, easing the heavy door open just enough to slip inside, the blast of refrigerated air hitting them both like a physical shock after the warmth of the basement. Through the gap in the cooler door, Elena could see a sliver of the back hallway, and the dark shape of a man standing guard near the office door, gun held low and ready, his posture radiating the particular tension of someone trained for exactly this kind of work. One target, she breathed, barely audible, even pressed this close to Roman, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his body, despite the cold of the cooler around them. I can take him. Elena, trust me. She didn't wait for his answer. She eased the cooler door open another 6 inches, slipped through into the dim hallway, moving low and silent. Every year of training her father had drilled into her, converging into this single narrow window of opportunity. The guard's back was 3/4 turned. Attention split between the front of the shop and a radio clipped to his shoulder that crackled faintly with static. She closed the distance in 4 silent steps and drove the heel of her palm into the base of his skull with everything she had, following it immediately with a sharp twist of his weapon hand that wrenched the gun free before he could even register what was happening. He staggered, disoriented, and Roman emerged from the shadows behind her, driving a fist into the man's jaw that dropped him cold against the tile floor with a heavy, final thud. Clean, Roman breathed, chest heaving, adrenaline making his hands shake even as his voice stayed controlled. Elena, that was... The sound of gunfire from the front of the shop shattered whatever he'd been about to say. 3 sharp cracks followed by the shattering of glass. And both of them froze for half a second before instinct took over and they were moving, sprinting down the hallway toward the front of the building where Dominic and Anthony had drawn the rest of the ambush exactly as planned, and walked straight into far more men than anyone had accounted for. The front of the shop was chaos. Display cases shattered, glass scattered across the tile floor catching the fractured light. Dominic crouched behind the counter exchanging fire with 2 men positioned near the front door, while Anthony, blood already streaming from a graze along his temple, dragged himself behind an overturned table for cover. 4 of them, Dominic shouted over the gunfire, voice tight with strain. Maybe 5. There's another position by the side window. A bullet tore through the air, close enough to Roman's head that Elena felt the displacement of it against her cheek, and pure instinct took over, her body moving before conscious thought could catch up, dragging Roman down behind the heavy steel prep table, just as another round splintered the wood inches from where his head had been. You almost... Roman's voice was raw, shaking, his hand gripping her arm hard enough to bruise as he stared at her with something close to panic. Elena, you could have... I didn't, she said, breathing hard, adrenaline making everything sharp and bright and terrifyingly clear. Focus! We need to even these odds before Dominic and Anthony run out of cover. Roman's face hardened, the fear transforming into something colder, more lethal, the same predatory focus she'd seen the very first night he'd walked into her shop expecting to find easy prey. He checked the weapon he'd taken off the guard in the hallway, ejected the magazine to check the count, and slammed it back home with a sharp, decisive click. Stay behind me. Not a chance. There wasn't time to argue further. Roman rose from behind the prep table, firing 2 controlled shots toward the front window that drove one of the gunmen back behind the doorframe, buying Dominic enough time to reload and return fire with renewed precision. Elena moved low along the side of the counter, working her way toward the side window position Dominic had warned them about. The cleaver Mrs. Choi had given her gripped tight in one hand, every nerve in her body screaming with a mixture of terror and a strange electric clarity she'd never experienced before. She came around the corner of the meat display case just as the 5th gunman, younger than the others, nervous energy radiating off him in waves she recognized immediately, the same desperate, hired muscle energy as the man who'd broken into her shop days earlier, swung his weapon toward her. Time slowed. She saw his finger tightening on the trigger, saw the exact angle of the barrel rising toward her chest, and her body moved on pure instinct, diving sideways into the meat display case as the shot cracked through the air where she'd been standing half a second earlier, glass exploding around her, shards biting into her exposed forearm as she hit the floor hard and rolled, came up swinging the cleaver in a wide, desperate arc that caught the gunman's wrist and sent his weapon clattering across the tile. He screamed more in shock than pain and lunged at her barehanded, and Elena met him with everything her father had ever taught her. Every pressure point, every disabling strike, years of muscle memory, built one quiet lesson at a time, finally unleashing in a violence that felt both foreign and inevitable. She drove her knee into his stomach, followed with an elbow to his temple that staggered him, and finished it with a strike to his throat that dropped him gasping to the floor beside his own discarded weapon. She was bleeding from a dozen small cuts along her arm, her breath tearing ragged out of her chest, blood and sweat mixing on her skin. But she was standing, and the gunman wasn't getting back up. "Elena!" Roman's voice, raw with panic, cutting through the chaos. "Behind you!" She spun just in time to see the last gunman, the leader, she realized, the only one wearing something close to tactical gear instead of the casual mismatched clothing of hired muscle. Emerging from the side hallway with his weapon already raised, already aimed, and there was no time at all to dodge or block or do anything except watch the barrel of the gun swing toward her with terrible, inevitable precision. The shot rang out, but it didn't come from the gunman's weapon. Roman had thrown himself across the space between them, his own gun raised, firing twice in rapid succession, and the leader staggered, his shot going wide, shattering what remained of the front window instead of finding its target. He crumpled against the doorframe, weapon slipping from his fingers, and the shop fell suddenly, violently silent, except for the ragged breathing of everyone still standing. Elena's ears rang. Her arm throbbed where the glass had cut deep, blood running warm down to her wrist, dripping onto the tile floor of her father's shop, in a pattern that looked horribly similar to every animal she'd ever broken down on this very counter. She turned to find Roman already moving toward her, his own face streaked with sweat and a thin line of blood from a graze along his cheekbone, his hands shaking as he reached for her, checking the cuts along her arm with a desperation that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with something neither of them had named yet. "You're bleeding," he said, voice cracking. "So are you." "I don't care about me." His hands cupped her face, careful despite the violence still humming through both their bodies, his thumb brushing blood and sweat from her cheek with a tenderness that felt impossibly out of place in a room full of broken glass and unconscious men. "I almost lost you. Twice tonight. I can't—" The sound of a radio crackling near the fallen leader's body cut through whatever he'd been about to say, both of them freezing as a voice crackled through, tinny and distant, asking for a status update, asking if the targets had been secured. Dominic limped over from behind the counter, blood soaking through the sleeve of his shirt where a bullet had grazed him, his face grim as he crouched beside the fallen leader and pulled the radio free from the man's jacket. "This isn't over," he said, voice tight with pain and certainty both. "This was the first wave. Whoever's running this operation, they're listening on the other end of that radio right now, waiting to hear that we're dead. The second they realize we're not, they're going to send everything they've got." Anthony pulled himself up from behind the overturned table, pressing a bloodied handkerchief against the graze along his temple, his 68-year-old frame trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion both. "He's right. Vincent's not going to send 5 men and call it a night. If this was a real attempt, there's a second team somewhere close, ready to finish the job the second this one reports failure." Roman's hands tightened against Elena's face for one more second before he forced himself to release her, turning to survey the wreckage of the shop with a cold, calculating focus that pushed every trace of softness back behind the armor he'd spent 3 years building. "Then we don't give them the chance to regroup," he said, voice hardening into something lethal. "Dominic, can you get a location off that radio? Triangulate where the signal's coming from." "Maybe. It'll take time we might not have." "Make the time." Roman turned back to Elena, and for one more second, the softness flickered back into his eyes before he forced it down again. "Elena, I need you to think. Vincent's been planning this for years. He doesn't just want the family business. He wants me gone, completely, and he wants it to look clean, like an internal collapse instead of a hostile takeover. If tonight was supposed to end with all of us dead in your father's shop, what's his story afterward? How does he explain it?" Elena's mind raced, pieces clicking together through the haze of adrenaline and pain, the cold, analytical part of her brain that her father had spent years sharpening, cutting through the panic to find the shape of the answer. "A turf war," she said slowly. "He frames it as a turf war gone wrong. The Irish syndicate, the Costello family, caught in the crossfire of a dispute over territory, with you and your closest people conveniently dead in the middle of it, leaving the family leaderless and desperate for someone to step in and restore order. And he's standing right there ready to be that someone," Roman finished grimly. "Family blood, already established, already trusted by half the captains who remember him from before he got sent to Chicago. Nobody questions a cousin stepping up to save a family in crisis." "Which means," Anthony said, voice grim, pressing harder against his bleeding temple, "he can't let any of us walk out of here to tell a different story. Dead men don't contradict a narrative, Roman. We're not just targets anymore. We're the only people alive who know the truth." The radio crackled again, the distant voice growing more urgent, demanding a response, and all 4 of them stood in the wreckage of the shop, blood and glass and broken trust scattered across the floor around them, understanding with brutal, undeniable clarity that whatever came next wouldn't be another skirmish, wouldn't be another careful exchange of evidence and accusation. It would be the end. One way or another, tonight, somebody's story was going to stop being written. "There's only one way this ends clean," Roman said finally, voice gone cold and certain in a way that made Elena's chest tighten, with something that felt dangerously close to dread. "We go to him, tonight, before he has the chance to send anyone else, before he has the chance to regroup and try this again somewhere we're not ready for it." "Roman, that's exactly what he wants," Elena said. "Walking into wherever he's hiding, exhausted, bleeding, outnumbered." "He doesn't know we survived yet," Roman cut in, gesturing toward the radio still crackling uselessly in Dominic's hand. "For the next few minutes, as far as Vincent knows, his men finished the job. That's the only advantage we're going to get tonight, and it's not going to last. We use it now, or we lose it completely." Dominic was already working at the radio, fingers moving fast despite the blood soaking through his sleeve, an old, practiced skill surfacing through the chaos. "Give me 2 minutes. If I can isolate the frequency, get a rough location off the signal strength." "Do it!" Elena looked down at her own bleeding arm, at the shattered glass and scattered blood across the floor of the shop her father had built with his own hands over 30 years. The shop that had somehow become the center of a war she'd never asked to fight. And felt something settle inside her chest, cold and absolute and entirely unlike the fear she probably should have been feeling. "If we're doing this," she said, voice steady despite the blood still dripping from her arm, "I'm not staying behind." "Elena, don't." Her eyes locked on his, fierce and unyielding, the same look she'd given him the very first night with a knife pressed to his throat. "You don't get to protect me by leaving me out of the part that actually matters. I've been in this since the moment Sal Bruno walked into my shop. I'm not stopping now just because it's about to get worse." Roman stared at her for a long moment, something complicated and raw moving behind his eyes. Fear, frustration, and underneath both of those, something that looked dangerously close to the particular helplessness of a man who'd just realized he could no longer separate his own survival from someone else's. "Got it," Dominic said suddenly, looking up from the radio with grim satisfaction cutting through the pain etched across his face. "Signals coming from an old shipping warehouse off the reserve channel, down by the waterfront. It's one of the Costello family's properties. Used to run legitimate cargo through there 20 years ago before my father shifted operations elsewhere. Vincent's hiding in our own family's old warehouse," Roman said, something dark and furious twisting across his face. "Using our own history against us." "That's not hiding," Anthony said grimly, finally lowering the bloodied handkerchief from his temple, his old eyes sharp despite the pain etched into every line of his face. "That's a message. He wants you to know exactly where to find him, Roman. He's not running. He's waiting." The shop fell silent except for the distant wail of a siren somewhere blocks away. Drawing closer, someone in the neighborhood finally having called in the gunfire, and Roman's jaw tightened with the cold calculation of a man running out of time on every front at once. "We need to move before the police arrive and complicate everything," he said. "Dominic, Anthony, can you both still fight?" "Try and stop us," Dominic said grimly, despite the blood still soaking through his sleeve. Roman turned to Elena one final time, and in his eyes she saw the full weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. The knife at his throat the first night, the secrets buried in her father's hidden files, the growing, dangerous thing that had built itself between them across 2 weeks of blood and betrayal and reluctant trust. "If we walk into that warehouse," he said quietly, "there's no version of tonight where everyone walks back out untouched. You understand that?" "I understood that the second I picked up that cleaver," Elena said, gripping the bloodied blade tighter in her hand, her father's voice steady in her memory even now, especially now. "Let's finish this." Outside, the sirens grew louder, and somewhere across the city, in an old warehouse that still smelled faintly of salt water and rust. Despite 20 years of disuse, Vincent Costello stood waiting in the dark, a radio in his hand gone ominously silent, beginning to understand that the report he'd been expecting was never going to come, and that the family he thought he'd already destroyed was instead coming straight for him, with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. The warehouse rose out of the waterfront dark like something already dead, corrugated steel walls streaked with 20 years of rust, the old Costello shipping logo barely visible beneath layers of grime and salt air. Roman parked 2 blocks out, killing the engine, and for a moment the 4 of them sat in silence. The only sound their own ragged breathing and the distant slap of harbor water against pilings. "Last chance to wait this one out," Roman said, not looking at Elena, though everyone in the car understood exactly who he was talking to. "Drive faster next time if you don't want me along," Elena said, already checking the cleaver in her grip, the gun she'd taken off the unconscious shooter back at the shop tucked into her waistband, cold against her hip. Dominic was the first one out, moving with the controlled limp of a man ignoring a bullet wound through sheer stubbornness, scanning the loading dock entrance with the same patient calculation he'd used his whole career. Anthony followed slower, blood still crusted along his temple, but his eyes were sharp, alert. A 68-year-old body running on nothing but decades of discipline and the particular fury of a man who'd just learned how badly he'd been played. The side door hung slightly ajar, light spilling out in a thin yellow line across the wet asphalt. An invitation. "He's expecting us," Roman murmured. "He's expecting bodies," Elena corrected, "not us walking in upright." They moved through the door in a low crouch, weapons raised, and found themselves in a cavernous space stacked with rusted shipping containers, the air thick with the smell of salt and motor oil, and something colder underneath. The particular silence of a place built for violence and emptied out for exactly that purpose. In the center of the open floor, under a single hanging work light that swayed slightly in a draft from somewhere, stood Vincent Costello. He looked nothing like what Elena had pictured, not some snarling caricature of betrayal, but a man in his late 30s with Roman's same dark hair, the same set jaw, family resemblance unmistakable even across the distance. Except where Roman's eyes carried a controlled, simmering intensity, Vincent's were flat, almost bored, the eyes of a man who'd spent so long rehearsing this moment in his head that the reality barely registered as real anymore. "You're late," Vincent said, voice carrying easily across the empty warehouse. "I expected my report 20 minutes ago." "Your men are dead or unconscious on the floor of a butcher shop," Roman said, stepping forward, weapon steady despite the visible tremor of exhaustion running through his whole body. "You're going to have to settle for me delivering the news in person." Vincent's expression didn't change, not even a flicker, and that absence of reaction unsettled Elena more than rage would have. "Disappointing. I paid good money for competence." He glanced past Roman, eyes settling on Elena with something cold and assessing. "Ms. Mercer, your father caused my family more headaches than you'll ever know. I have to admit, some small part of me is glad to finally meet the daughter who inherited his stubbornness, even if it's the last thing you ever do." "You sent Sal Bruno into my shop," Elena said, voice flat, refusing to let the threat land anywhere near her composure. "You used my father's death to set this whole thing in motion." "I used an opportunity," Vincent said, almost gentle, almost reasonable, the calm of a man who genuinely believed his own logic. Marcus Mercer was the only loose thread left from my father's exile, the only man who actually had the proof of what really happened 11 years ago, buried in that shop the whole time, waiting for someone smart enough to use it. I just needed a reason to get my cousin curious enough to go looking. Sending Sal in to provoke you was supposed to be simple. I didn't account for you putting him on the floor in under 10 seconds. Something almost like respect flickered behind the dead calm of his eyes. "That should have told me you were more trouble than I planned for. I'm rarely wrong about people. I was wrong about you." 11 years, Roman said, voice shaking now, not with fear, but with something closer to grief curdling into fury. "You've been planning this for 11 years, Vincent. We grew up together. You used to spend summers at my father's house. And every one of those summers, I watched your father look at mine like he was something he'd scraped off his shoe," Vincent said, and for the first time real heat broke through the flat calm of his voice, old and ugly, and clearly never healed. "My father built half this family's territory with his own hands, and the second a power struggle came down to which brother got to keep Boston, your father won because he was willing to be crueler, not because he was smarter. They shipped my father to Chicago like a consolation prize and told him to be grateful. I watched him die out there, Roman, slow and bitter, exiled from everything he built, while you got to grow up in that penthouse playing prince of a kingdom that should have been mine. So you decided to burn it all down instead," Elena said. "I decided to take back what should have always been mine," Vincent corrected, voice hardening. And I would have managed it clean, quiet, if your father hadn't kept those records. If you hadn't gone digging through them instead of selling the shop and walking away like any sensible person would have. His eyes flicked to Roman. You should have let your organization fall apart from the inside, cousin. Suspicion, paranoia, you turning on Dominic, that was working beautifully until she started pulling threads I needed left alone. Dominic's jaw tightened, weapon raising slightly. You set me up. 11 years of loyalty, and you were willing to burn me for it without blinking. Nothing personal, Dominic. You were simply useful as a distraction. Vincent's gaze swept across all four of them, calculating, patient. A man who still believed, even standing alone in an empty warehouse with four armed people in front of him, that he held every advantage in the room. Which brings us to the part where I explain why none of you are leaving this building. He raised two fingers, a small, almost lazy gesture, and the sound of multiple footsteps emerged from behind the stacked containers on either side of the warehouse floor. 6 men, maybe 7, weapons already raised, emerging from positions that had clearly been prepared and waiting long before any of them had walked through that door. You didn't think I'd come alone to watch you fail twice in one night, did you? Vincent said, almost gently. I told you, I'm rarely wrong about people. I knew you'd survive the shop. I knew you'd come here anyway because that's exactly the kind of reckless, prideful mistake my cousin has always made. So I prepared accordingly. The warehouse went deathly quiet. The only sound the soft creak of the swaying worklight and the ragged breathing of 4 exhausted, bleeding people staring down the barrels of 7 fresh weapons with nothing left in reserve but desperation. Roman, Elena breathed, barely audible. I know. Drop your weapons, Vincent said, voice gone cold and final. Or this gets considerably less clean than I was planning. For one terrible, suspended second, nobody moved. Elena's mind raced through every possibility, every angle, every desperate calculation her father had ever drilled into her, and found nothing. No clever exit, no hidden advantage, just 4 exhausted people and 7 loaded guns in an empty warehouse that smelled like rust and inevitability. It was Anthony who moved first. The old man's hand, the one not pressed against his bleeding temple, dropped slowly toward his waistband, and Elena understood, in the half-second before it happened, that he wasn't reaching for surrender. Anthony, don't! Roman started. Anthony fired first, catching the nearest gunman in the shoulder, and the warehouse exploded into chaos. Elena hit the ground instinctively, rolling behind the nearest shipping container as gunfire tore through the space where she'd been standing, the deafening crack of it bouncing off corrugated steel walls until the whole world seemed to be nothing but noise and muzzle flash and the acrid bite of gunpowder. She came up firing, 2 shots toward the silhouette of a gunman advancing on Dominic's flank, missing wide but buying enough hesitation for Dominic to drop low and return fire with brutal precision. Roman had gone to ground near the center of the floor, exchanging fire with 2 men advancing from his left, his face a mask of cold, focused fury, every shot controlled despite the chaos exploding around him. Elena watched, heart in her throat, as a round caught his shoulder, spinning him sideways with a sharp cry of pain that he swallowed almost instantly, forcing himself back upright, weapon still raised. Roman! I'm fine, keep moving. She wasn't fine, but there was no time to argue. No time to do anything except keep moving, keep fighting, keep breathing through the chaos as the warehouse became a maze of muzzle flash and shouting and the specific terrible music of violence at its most chaotic. Elena ducked behind another container, breath tearing in her lungs, blood from the glass cuts on her arm mixing with fresh sweat, and forced herself to think instead of simply react. 6 men. Maybe 5 now, with Anthony's first shot landing true. Dominic was pinned but holding. Roman was wounded but upright. And somewhere in the chaos, Vincent Costello had retreated toward the back of the warehouse, using the confusion as cover, exactly the kind of careful, calculated self-preservation Elena had expected from a man who'd spent 11 years orchestrating other people's destruction from a comfortable distance. She wasn't letting him disappear into the shadows again. She moved low and fast along the edge of the containers, putting herself between the chaos of the main firefight and the back corridor where she'd glimpsed Vincent's retreating shape, every instinct her father had ever taught her converging into a single, narrow point of focus. She found him in a side office, the door half closed. Vincent standing at a desk with a phone pressed to his ear, voice low and urgent, calling for something. Reinforcements. An exit plan? She didn't know and didn't care. She kicked the door fully open. Vincent spun, phone clattering to the floor, his hand already moving toward the weapon at his hip. But Elena was faster, had been faster her entire life without ever fully understanding why, until a man with a knife to his throat had told her the truth about her father 2 weeks ago. She crossed the distance in 3 strides and drove the cleaver down in a controlled arc, not toward his throat, not a killing strike, but hard enough to bury the blade into the wooden desk an inch from his reaching hand, close enough that he froze completely, staring at the blade quivering inches from his fingers. "Don't," Elena said, weapon raised now, leveled at his chest, her voice steady despite the chaos still echoing from the main floor behind her. "Don't make me finish what my father should have started 11 years ago." Vincent's flat calm finally cracked, something raw and afraid bleeding through for the first time since they'd walked into this warehouse. "You won't shoot me. You're not like them. Your father kept secrets, sure, but he never pulled a trigger in his life. I know his record. I know exactly what kind of man he was." "You don't know anything about my father," Elena said, voice low and dangerous, "except what was useful for you to learn so you could use his death against his own daughter. You sent men into his shop. You put your hands on a building he built with 30 years of his life. You don't get to tell me what I am or what I'm not capable of." The gunfire from the main floor was dying down, replaced by shouts, by the distinct sound of Dominic's voice calling out that the warehouse was clear, that the last of Vincent's men had either fled or fallen. Elena kept her weapon trained on Vincent, her hand steady despite the adrenaline and exhaustion screaming through every muscle in her body, and watched the last of his composure crumble into something desperate. "This doesn't end the way you think it does," Vincent said, voice cracking. "Even if you kill me here, the Irish syndicate's already moved against 3 of Roman's shipments this month. The damage is done. His organization is already bleeding out. You think killing me saves him?" "I think," Elena said, "that you're a coward who built 11 years of resentment into an excuse to hurt people who never did anything to you, and I think the only thing that's going to save you right now is the fact that I'm not the one who gets to decide what happens to you." She glanced past him, toward the doorway, where Roman now stood, weapon raised, blood soaking through the shoulder of his shirt, his face a mask of controlled fury staring at the cousin who'd spent over a decade planning his destruction. "Roman," Vincent breathed, something almost like relief in his voice, the desperate hope of a man clinging to family ties even now. "Cousin, we can talk about this. We're blood. That has to count for something." Roman stepped into the room slowly, weapon never wavering, and Elena watched something terrible and exhausted move behind his eyes. 34 years of family history, of summers spent together, of every memory now poisoned by the knowledge of exactly how long this betrayal had been brewing beneath the surface. "You're right," Roman said quietly. "We are blood. And blood is exactly why I'm not going to kill you here, even though every part of me wants to." Vincent's shoulders sagged with relief that lasted exactly as long as it took Roman to finish his sentence. "Instead, you're going to spend the rest of your life somewhere you can think very carefully about what family actually means," Roman continued, voice gone cold and absolute. "Dominic's already calling people who will make sure the right authorities find exactly enough evidence to put you away for a very long time. Not for the family to handle quietly, for the actual justice system to handle, publicly, permanently. Because that's the thing about you, Vincent. You always wanted what my father built, but you never once understood that the only reason it survived as long as it did was because somewhere underneath all the violence, there was still a code. Loyalty. Lines you didn't cross." His voice cracked, just slightly, just enough for the grief underneath the fury to show through. "You crossed every single one of them, and I'm done letting blood be an excuse for that." Vincent's face crumpled, the careful mask finally shattering completely, 11 years of patient, calculated resentment collapsing into something small and frightened and, for the first time since they'd walked into this warehouse, entirely human. "Roman, please." "Don't," Roman said quietly, and the single word carried more weight than any threat he'd made all night. "Don't make this harder than it already is." The sirens that had followed them from Elena's shop finally caught up to the warehouse 20 minutes later. But by then, Dominic had already made the calls that mattered. Careful, precise calls to people who existed in the particular gray space between organized crime and law enforcement that men like him had spent decades cultivating. By the time uniformed officers arrived, Vincent Costello sat zip-tied and silent in the corner of the warehouse office, surrounded by enough physical evidence, recordings, financial records, 11 years of carefully documented betrayal that Anthony and Dominic had assembled in the hours since this nightmare began, to ensure that whatever happened next would happen in a courtroom, in daylight, permanently. Elena sat on the loading dock outside, the cold harbor air doing little to cool the adrenaline still burning through her veins, watching paramedics work on the shoulder wound that had torn through Roman's flesh an inch from anything vital. He winced as they cleaned it, jaw tight, but his eyes never left her, watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with the pain radiating through his own body. "You should let them look at your arm," he said, nodding toward the dried blood crusted along her forearm where the glass had cut deep. "I will, after they finish with you." "Elena, I'm not going anywhere, Roman." Something in his face shifted at that. Exhaustion and relief, and something far more complicated all moving across his features at once. And for a long moment, neither of them said anything else, just sat in the cold harbor air, listening to the distant sound of more sirens, the chaos of a war finally, definitively over. "My father built something ugly," Roman said finally, voice quiet, almost lost beneath the harbor wind. "I spent 3 years telling myself I was just protecting it, holding it together because that's what was expected of me. Tonight, watching my own cousin try to burn it all down out of 11 years of bitterness, watching what that kind of resentment does to a person, what it costs everyone around them, I don't know if I want to keep protecting it anymore. Not like this. Not built on fear." "So don't," Elena said simply. "It's not that easy. Nothing ever is." She turned to look at him fully, blood and exhaustion etched into both their faces. Two people who'd started this as strangers on opposite sides of a knife and ended it as something neither of them had a clean word for yet. "But you've got Dominic, you've got Anthony, you've got an entire neighborhood full of people who watched you choose to protect them instead of exploit them, starting with one stubborn butcher's daughter who refused to pay protection money. That's not nothing, Roman. That's actually the beginning of something better, if you're willing to build it." Roman studied her for a long moment, something tender and uncertain moving behind his exhausted eyes. "You'd help with that? Building something better? I helped you find a traitor, survive an ambush, and watched you almost get shot twice in one night," Elena said, the faintest hint of a tired smile finally breaking through her exhaustion. "I think I'm already more invested in this than I planned on being." 6 months passed, and the rebuilding happened slowly, in the way real change always does. Not in dramatic gestures, but in small, deliberate choices made over and over until they became habit, became culture, became the new shape of something that had been broken for a very long time. Mercer and Son reopened with a fresh coat of paint and a new sign that Elena had commissioned to read simply Mercer's, no longer needing the false promise of a son who'd never existed. The shop standing as a testament to a woman who'd inherited far more than she'd ever known. Local business owners along Dorchester Avenue stopped paying protection money entirely. The Costello family's presence in the neighborhood transformed from extortion into something that almost resembled actual community investment. Storefronts repaired, a youth center funded anonymously, the particular quiet generosity of a man trying to build something worth the cost of what it had taken to get there. Dominic recovered fully from his gunshot wound and took over day-to-day security operations with a renewed sense of purpose. His loyalty to Roman deeper than ever, the betrayal of false accusation healed slowly through the steady proof of trust, rebuilt one decision at a time. Anthony retired from active involvement but remained close, a quiet advisor whenever Roman needed the perspective of someone who'd watched 3 generations of this family rise and fall, and rise again. Vincent Costello's trial made headlines for exactly as long as these things usually do, before the city's attention moved on to the next scandal, the next crisis. And somewhere in a federal facility upstate, a man who'd spent 11 years planning a takeover finally had nothing left to plan at all. Just decades of quiet time to consider exactly what his resentment had cost him. And Roman Valenti, slowly, carefully, began to understand what it meant to lead something without fear as the foundation. On a clear evening in early autumn, almost exactly a year after a black SUV had first pulled up outside a small butcher shop in the rain, Roman walked through the door of Mercer's without bodyguards, without an entourage, just a man in a simple jacket carrying a small paper bag that he set carefully on the counter. Elena looked up from where she was closing out the register, the easy, tired smile that crossed her face, now nothing like the guarded wariness of that first terrible night. "You're late." "Traffic," Roman said, though they both knew it wasn't true, that he simply preferred walking these days, preferred feeling the actual weight of the neighborhood under his own feet instead of watching it pass by behind tinted glass. "What's in the bag?" "Cannoli, from the place on Hanover that Anthony swears by." He set it down, leaning against the counter in a posture that had become so familiar over the last year that it no longer registered as strange. The most feared man in South Boston, comfortable, unguarded, in a butcher shop that smelled of sawdust and old blood and something that had slowly, quietly become like a second home. "You spoil me. You earned it, putting up with me for a year." Roman's voice carried a lightness that hadn't existed in him a year ago, a weight lifted that neither of them spoke about directly anymore. The particular piece of two people who'd survived something together and come out the other side changed by it. Elena finished locking the register, came around the counter, and for a moment they simply stood together in the quiet of the closed shop, the evening light slanting gold through the front windows. The street outside, finally, genuinely peaceful in a way it hadn't been in years. "My father used to say something," Elena said quietly, looking toward the old photograph she'd hung behind the counter. Marcus Mercer, younger, smiling, an apron identical to the one she still wore every single day. "Strength isn't about being the most dangerous person in the room. It's about being the person somebody else can stand next to without fear." I used to think that was just something he said to make a butcher shop sound noble. I understand it differently now. Roman reached for her hand, calloused fingers lacing through hers with the easy familiarity of something built slowly, deliberately, over months of choosing each other again and again, even when it would have been easier not to. "The strongest person I've ever known," he said quietly, "was never one of my soldiers. Wasn't my father, wasn't Dominic, wasn't anyone I spent years afraid of disappointing. It was a woman who held a knife to my throat the first night I met her and never once let me forget that fear isn't the same thing as respect." Elena smiled, tired and real and entirely unguarded, the particular smile of someone who'd finally stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, who'd built something solid enough to trust completely. "True strength," she said, echoing words that felt less like something she was repeating and more like something she'd finally earned the right to say herself, "isn't measured by how much fear you can create. It's measured by who's still standing beside you when everything's already been taken from you and there's nothing left to gain from staying." Outside, the neighborhood lights began flickering on one by one against the deepening blue of the evening sky, warm and steady, illuminating a street that had spent years living in fear and was finally, slowly, learning what it felt like to simply exist without it. Somewhere down the block, kids were playing in an alley that had once been a crime scene, laughter carrying faintly through the cooling evening air, the particular sound of a neighborhood healing in real time, one ordinary evening at a time. Roman pulled Elena gently into the curve of his arm, and together they stood in the doorway of a butcher shop that had survived 30 years of secrets, a war that nearly destroyed everyone connected to it, and a love neither of them had expected to find in the wreckage of all that violence, looking out at a city finally beginning to breathe again, built not on fear, but on the quiet, unglamorous, hard-won foundation of two people who'd chosen, again and again, to stand beside each other when it would have been so much easier to walk away. The war that began with a knife at a Mafia boss's throat had ended, finally, completely. Not with revenge, but with something far rarer in a world built on violence, two unlikely souls who'd looked into the absolute worst of what this city could offer and chosen, deliberately, painfully, to build something better out of the ashes of everything that had tried to destroy them. And as the last light faded from the sky over South Boston, the butcher shop's window glowing warm and steady against the coming night, their story reached the only ending that had ever truly mattered. Not the end of a war, but the beginning of everything that came after it.